Good evening and welcome to the Late Debate. Tonight, the European Union. Should we stay or should we go? And what it all means for London. Later, I'll be talking to a panel of the capital's politicians from the Commons, the Lords and the European Parliament. But first, the London Cabinet Minister heading the campaign to pull us out of the EU. She might be the lesser known of the Cabinet's two Theresas, but the referendum has put the MP for Chipping Barnet in the spotlight. Away from her constituency, she's most likely to be seen in London, arriving in Downing Street for meetings. But much of the time, this former MEP can be found in another city, Belfast, where the once poisonous chalice of Northern Ireland Secretary keeps her busy. Whether she's treading the tightrope between the parties at Stormont, hosting VIP visitors like Hillary Clinton, or promoting trade and business. She's a familiar figure at the Ballymena factory where the new Boris bus is put together. Villiers demonstrated her Eurosceptic credentials at a Tory conference almost 2 decades ago when, in front of two of the party's biggest beasts, she launched a withering attack on those campaigning for closer ties.
With the greatest respect to that past record, they are yesterday's men talking yesterday's politics.
When the private finance scheme to upgrade London's tube network began to unravel, Villiers was David Cameron's shadow transport secretary. She was quick to point the finger of blame at Gordon Brown.
He had plenty of warnings, and now the chickens are really coming home to roost. He's got no one to blame but himself.
Today, Theresa Villiers has an addition to her CV. Front-bench Brexiter. And Theresa Villiers has joined me in the studio now. Yesterday's men talking yesterday's politics. What do you remember of that conference speech?
Well, I'm very impressed you've been able to dig that up. But I mean, in a way, that sentiment is still the same today, that so much about the European project is still sort of stuck in the 1950s. I think with a Brexit vote, we'd be more open to the world, we'd have a friendly trading relationship with Europe, but we'd be back in control of our own democracy and our own immigration. I think that's very forward-looking.
Of course, after that speech, you became a Euro MP. Has Europe been a driving passion of yours?
It's always been a source of very serious concern. When I was elected to the European Parliament, I was concerned about the direction of travel of the European project. After I'd spent 6 years there, I was very clear.
You weren't tempted to go native there?
No, I was. By the end of my time there, I was very clear that the UK would be better off outside the European Union with friendly cooperation, but not subject to EU law and subject to the European Court of Justice.
What did you learn there about the EU and its plus points?
Well, I think the plus points is it is a forum for cooperation, but the downside is it's very inflexible. There's only one destination, there's only one solution in Brussels to every problem, and that's more political integration, more Europe, more centralisation.
In all that time there, you must have seen some merits, though.
Certainly, I worked very hard to try and promote sort of cross-border trade. I focused particularly on financial services, and there were some successes. There was some sort of successful attempts to liberalise markets, but they were, they were limited. And my concern is that, the European project is continually ratcheting away more power and more of our money, and that's what we face if we stay in. It's a really risky option to stay in.
What does it feel like going into opposition with the Prime Minister?
It's obviously a very uncomfortable process for all of us, I think on both sides of the debate, but I think it was a very sort of generous-spirited and decision by the Prime Minister to allow those of us in his cabinet who have long-standing views on Europe to follow our consciences on this, so that we can have a clear debate on this referendum issue.
You say uncomfortable process. Is it actually uncomfortable now being with those other cabinet members who disagree with you?
On a personal level, we're all getting on absolutely fine. But yes, certainly it's an awkward situation. It's a matter of regret to me that I find myself on the other side of the debate to the Prime Minister and the government. But what we are talking about is whether this country becomes an independent, self-governing democracy again. It wasn't an issue I could dodge. I had to be on the Leave side. My conscience wouldn't let me be on the other side.
And what did you think of the Chancellor's report this week?
I think that my real concern about it was the acknowledgement that immigration is likely to be at around 200,000 even well on into the 2020s. So it doesn't show confidence in our ability to keep our manifesto promise on that. And I think that's one of the advantages of leaving the EU. is that we would get back more control over our borders. We'd be able to set a humane and sensible immigration policy which allowed us to bring in the best and the brightest from around the world, but didn't force us to accept all EU citizens just because they happen to have an EU passport.
We're familiar with the phrase Project Fear. How much scaremongering do you think is coming out of the Remain side?
Well, certainly Project Fear is a big part of their campaign. But I think what people really need to understand is looking at the facts, actually, that the risks of staying in are far greater. It's not a question of choosing between the safe status quo and some unknown sort of theoretical position. There is no status quo in the European Union. Being a member of the European Union is buying into a process of continuous change, as Michael Gove said. It's like being locked in the back of the car and driven.
Surely better to stay in and fight for reform from within?
6 years in Brussels convinced me that the EU is unreformable. At their heart, they always think that political union and us giving more power and more money to the EU is the answer to every problem. People have been trying to turn Europe our way for 40 years, and they haven't succeeded in making Europe change direction. And now the Eurozone has got an inbuilt majority. It can outvote us on everything. So the situation is only going to get a lot worse.
You say unreformable. You were there for 6 years. Did you make any efforts? Could you try anything?
Certainly, I worked very hard. And as I say, in terms of the debates about market opening, cross-border trade, market liberalisation, there were undoubtedly some successes along the way. I wouldn't say it was all bad news, but I think that our economy will flourish outside the European Union. I think people in this country want to go back to a situation where the people who make our laws are the people they get to vote out at a general election if they want to. Democratic control is what this is all about.
So what did you think when the Chancellor said families will be £4,000 plus a year worse off by 2034?
Well, I mean, actually, what I think is worth recognising is that even that gloomy prospectus produced by the Treasury acknowledged that we'd still be growing as an economy. In their view, we might grow slightly more slowly. But even if you accept that, actually, if you look at the numbers in the light of the immigration figures, if the rise in population is slightly slower than anticipated in that Treasury report, actually the 4,300 theoretical loss disappears altogether. So if actually we bring our immigration numbers down, we don't even have the loss that the Chancellor predicted.
You're not tempted to dismiss his document as dodgy?
There are certain ways in which the analysis has been done, which I wouldn't agree with, but I think the main problem with it is an acknowledgement that immigration is going to be well above into the 200,000 mark, which is something that we have a manifesto commitment which conflicts with that. I think that is worrying.
And if we do leave and you're still Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, you then have a land border with Europe. How awkward is that going to be?
I think the land border can function in exactly the same way as it does now. We had what's known as a common travel area with the Republic of Ireland for decades before the two countries joined the EU. There's no reason why that can't continue after we leave the EU.
Theresa Villiers, thank you very much for coming in to talk to us. That's where we have to leave that for the moment. But we move on now. Surprising though it may seem, the referendum isn't the only political campaign in town. You might be forgiven for overlooking the battle for City Hall, which reaches its climax in 2 weeks' time. After all, both contests often feature the same cast. When London's multitasking mayor took to the stage in Manchester almost a week ago, it was a clear signal. Boris Johnson is the star turn in the campaign to persuade voters to leave the EU.
Watch out, here we go.
But he's also involved in a campaign closer to home. The mayor can often be seen alongside the Tory hoping to replace him at City Hall. In London, the EU referendum and election for mayor have collided, and when it comes to Europe, the two mayoral frontrunners are on opposite sides.
Any candidate who thinks London's future lies outside of the European Union doesn't understand our city, doesn't understand the social benefits, the cultural benefits, the benefits to our security, or the benefits to our economy.
I believe the biggest risk for London is not coming out of Europe or staying in Europe. The biggest risk to London is if London embraces what I think is an anti-business, hostile, aggressive and backward-looking agenda.
This is the fifth time Londoners have been asked to choose a mayor, but there's little evidence the campaign has captured the imagination of voters. None of the candidates is a household name, for now anyway. So is the election being overshadowed by the referendum?
I have to say the EU referendum is not proving that much of a distraction. I think most Londoners are pretty decided that they want to stay in the EU.
When you talk about the EU, you're talking about getting control of our borders, and that's vitally important as well for London when it comes to housing, when it comes to the infrastructure, when it comes to overcrowding.
Certainly my party, if you're pro-European, would you vote for someone who doesn't support being in the EU? And I think that's going through lots of people's minds at the moment, but it's not coming up as an issue on the doorstep.
Whatever the outcome 2 weeks today, both sides in the Euro debate will be looking to see if Londoners choose a pro or anti-EU mayor. And just a reminder, there are 12 candidates standing in the election for Mayor of London. Polling takes place 2 weeks today from 7 a.m. until 10 p.m.